This week on the West Block.
The toppling of a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald has reignited the debate over how to honour Canada's first Prime Minister.
Statues and monuments called into question.
There's a problem, and you're not addressing it.
Sir John A. played a critical role in building this great nation.
Canada's first Black Justice Minister.
At a time when we are all rightfully more sensitive to the reality of racial prejudice, Alberta will have the first ever Canadian Justice Minister of African origin.
And is a fall election in the cards?
We're putting together a throne speech now that will set out this ambitious agenda before Parliament, and parliamentarians can decide, because we're in a minority situation, whether this government has the support to move forward.
Historical controversy calls for statues to be removed and rallies in support of, well, those same statues. And rumors as well of a fall election. We have a lot on the agenda, and here to talk about all of that and more is Heritage Minister Minister Guilbeault. Thank you for joining me, Minister.
Pleasure to be here.
Sir, the first thing that I wanted to talk about with you is what people are buzzing about, certainly here in Ottawa, but across the country as well, and that's the possibility of a fall election. Your government has been talking about transformative change in the throne speech. There are sources who are saying the government is looking at moving beyond fiscal anchors into significant new social programs and new territory. Does your government want an election this fall?
No, clearly not. And I would argue that Canadians don't want an election either. We are still in the midst of the worst pandemic and the worst crisis we've seen in the last 100 years. Many Canadians have lost their jobs. They're wondering how they're going to make ends meet. And we're still deploying a number of measures to help support Canadian businesses, Canadian organizations. Certainly in my sector, arts and culture, the sector has been severely impacted. So I think the last thing that people want at this point is an election.
If you feel that way, why introduce all of these significant new programs that we're hearing are likely to be in the throne speech? There's sources in finance saying that the government is going to abandon their fiscal anchors, reports that it could be as much as $100 billion being spent, that fundamentally transforms the way that Canadians are governed.
Well, when it comes to rumors, I like to say, hear all and trust nothing. We'll see what will be in the throne speech. Clearly, our government is an activist government. We've done a lot to help Canadians, and I think the pandemic has shown us that there are some pretty serious cracks in our social nets, which is why we had to put together very quickly the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, which 8 million Canadians benefited from. So I think there needs to be some thinking about what do we do next? Do we simply go back to the way things were, or do we try to build Canada better from an environmental perspective, from a social perspective, and also from an economic perspective?
I do want to switch gears to ask about your file specifically and what we've been seeing going on with protests across Canada that have seen statues torn down. One of Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, torn down and beheaded earlier this week when it fell to the ground. You're the Heritage Minister. What are your thoughts on the solution here? Do you think that tearing down statues is the right approach, or do you think that history should be taught, but the statues should be kept, revealing the full history, including the parts that have largely been taken out?
Well, clearly we need to do a better job at telling Canada's history, and when we look at our statues and across the country, it's only part of the story that we're telling. We rarely talk about the role of Indigenous people in Canada. We rarely talk about Canadians from immigration that have contributed significantly. So I think that as we go forward, we need to be very mindful and make more space for these people whom we've largely forgotten in in the past. Now, that being said, I don't think it shouldn't, and it won't be up to a handful of people to decide how this is done, and a group of protesters. These things have to be talked about. We have to come to decisions together on how we do it, and do this in an orderly manner. Taking down statues like that is clearly not the way to go. I mean, even Indigenous leaders in Canada have said that they didn't think that these protesters certainly didn't speak for them and didn't reflect necessarily the way they wanted to do this.
Minister, I do want to ask you as well about Facebook, Twitter, some of these internet giants that are here in Canada. There's been a lot of discussion, including in your cabinet, of whether these platforms are taking responsibility for some of the content that's being posted there, and calls to do more to regulate that. Also concerns about free speech. What's your approach in terms of getting these big internet giants that are not based in Canada to take responsibility for things that are put up that either incite violence or hate speech, or in some cases are basically just massive social media gang-ups?
Well, we have made a commitment to fight online hate, child pornography, and really an incitement to terrorism, and we are seeing a lot of that online, and we all are so seeing that these platforms can't regulate themselves. We've tried that, and it's simply not working. Now, there's a big difference between saying that we're going to regulate these hateful things and these appalling things, and we're going to put an end to free speech on the internet. That's really not what this is about. Just like we have free speech in our society, but people can't say everything. You can't verbally abuse someone. We have courts that have put measures around free speech. Well, we're doing it in the real world. We can do it on the virtual world as well. And this is something that myself, my colleague Minister Baines, obviously Justice Minister Lametti are working on, and we will be coming up with legislation in the very near future.
Minister Guilbeault, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Up next, an interview with Canada's first Black Justice Minister.
First Black Canadian Justice Minister or Attorney General or Solicitor General, who is a man who has experienced racial prejudice firsthand.
As Minister of Justice,
The father of three was born and raised in Nigeria, where he attended the University of Lagos and graduated with a law degree. In 2005, he immigrated to Canada to practice law in Alberta. In April of 2019, he was elected to the Alberta legislature.
Black Lives Matter!
Madu's appointment comes after a summer filled with anti-Black racism demonstrations and questions about systemic racism in Canada's justice system and police forces. Just hours into his new job, Madu wrote, "I am determined to make sure our justice system represents all Albertans in a way that is fair and accountable."
Regardless of political stance, it comes down to people that look like us being in those positions of power.
Madu says modernizing the Police Act will be a necessary step towards ensuring equality for marginalized people before the law. He joins us now for a one-on-one interview from Edmonton. Welcome to the show, Minister. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mercedes. Very glad to be here.
Minister, one of the big discussions that is being had in Canada right now is about systemic racism in the courts and in policing. Do you believe that that exists in Alberta?
You know, Mercedes, there is no question that we have still a lot of work to do when it comes to issues of racial equality and justice from the perspective of the minority community. There is no question that I have firsthand heard concerns with respect to policing and the justice system and the administration of same. There is no question, Mercedes, that as I have explained publicly, that this is one area that I have got lived experience. And so it is something that we will continue to work on, but one that I think that despite the present difficulties, that we have made progress and continue to make progress. And I am excited to be able to further the work towards progress.
You mentioned your firsthand experience with racial injustice. Can you tell us about that?
So, Mercedes, as I have said previously, when I came to this country, I came with nothing. And my first employment was at a small unit at the University of Alberta Hospital called Patient Food Services. It was where I had the honor and privilege to be able to wash dishes and make meals for our citizens who are going through a period of adversity at that point in time in their life. It was from there that I would go on to work for Legal Aid Alberta, where I saw firsthand, the issues that confront those who don't have what it takes to go through our justice system from a financial point of view. It was from Legal Aid that I went to work for the provincial government. And Mercedes, while I was in provincial government, as perfect as we have made progress, we still have, sadly, folks like myself who have the difficulty, to achieve their full potential within the public service and most of our public institutions. I always give an example of when I was about to Ethical. I would send hundreds of applications on a weekly basis under my real first name, which is Kelechi, spelled K-E-L-E-C-H-I. And I would hardly get a call back or an email back. And that got me thinking. Mercedes, where I was born and raised in Southeast Nigeria, people who are named Kelechi are called KC, simply K.C. And I had to create a name out of KC. And that is how I now came about my first name that I go with today, KC, K-A-Y-C-E-E. It was not until I was able to do that I began to see progress in terms of job interviews. And that tells you that your name and who you are, regardless of your qualifications and competence, still defines your success or chances of making progress in some of these professions. And I have been clear that issues of racism are real. I don't want to, for 1 second, minimize that particular point, because I do see a lot of our fellow citizens, Albertans, and folks across our country from the minority community complaining bitterly about issues of racism. Because I have lived it, I know it is real. But that is not to say that our society have not made progress. We have made tremendous progress, and I am excited at the opportunity, as I said, to further that particular work towards a more perfect society.
Sir, how do you do that as the Justice Minister in Alberta? What changes do you want to make? Because I know you've been asked about the defund police movement. You don't agree that that's the answer. So what are the changes that you think need to be made to policing and to justice, and how will you do that? So
the changes that we are looking to make are changes that will address the specific concerns that minority communities and indigenous communities have raised with respect to the application of the justice system and the way police services interact with them. As you know, the Premier of my province have authorized or given me the direction to review the Police Act. That work is underway. One of the concerns that I have heard way before I became a lawyer, way before I became an elected official, way before I became the Minister of Municipal Affairs or the Minister of Justice, is the issue of cordon and street checks. That I know for sure that there are problems there. And as Minister of Justice from that community, I am committed to making sure that those concerns are addressed. So that particular work is underway. Second, Mercedes, is the court system. I think that it is important that we got a court system, our courtrooms, and those who work within the four walls of our courtroom must reflect today's Alberta. If we want to have a public buy-in and confidence into our justice system from all walks of life, including folks from the minority community and indigenous community, I think it's important that we have folks will walk in those courtrooms to reflect today's Alberta. So as Justice Minister, I now have the opportunity to appoint judges to the provincial court, the level of court that I am responsible for. And you are going to be seeing progress in that particular regard. I do think there are qualified, minority lawyers, people who have spent their entire lifetime working in the justice system, who deserve a shot at the bench. And I am prepared and committed to making sure that that becomes a reality.
Minister, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Have a great day.
Up next, journalists on the Hill join me to talk about the possibility of a snap election, the Canadian economy, and the other top stories from the week.
You're watching the West Block on Global.
As we move forward in reimagining what the Canadian economy can look like in the coming years, we have an opportunity to go greener. We have an opportunity to be fairer, to reduce barriers for women's participation, for Indigenous participation in the workforce.
Welcome back. That was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on what to expect from the government's upcoming throne speech later this month. Joining me now to unpack this and the week's headlines, including election speculation and the possibility of abandoning fiscal anchors, is Abigail Beeman from Global National and Kirsty Kirkup from the Globe and Mail. Thank you both for joining me. Kirsty, a lot of discussion this week about whether or not there's going to be a fall election. What do the parties have to take into account when they determine whether or not this is a good idea?
I think that a lot of it comes down to finances and how much money they have, because ultimately we know that the NDP, they say they're election ready and they're not going to determine whether they're going to support a throne speech based on their financial situation. But ultimately, an election campaign right now would be extremely costly. The Conservatives as well have a brand new leader. Are they ready to take essentially the leadership campaign that Erin O'Toole just ran and ramp it up into a national campaign? Are the parties actually ready? In a minority parliament, you always have to be ready for an election call, but these are extraordinary times. And fundraising, by the way, there's no big fundraisers there. This has really affected the way that political parties are pulling in cash. They're trying to get creative, but it's one thing to try and get a bunch of people in a room and fundraise that way. Trying to fundraise on Zoom is a whole other battle.
But Abigail, one of the things they have to think about too is how Canadians will react to this election. Is there a risk that voters punish people who call an election during a pandemic? Or is there a possibility they look back, they watch what's happening with some of the provincial elections and say, see, it can be done?
I think that's a very important point to consider on top of those points that Kirsty raised, because I think a lot of Canadians don't want to go to the polls right now. And, you hear MPs from different parties acknowledging that and saying when they speak to people in their communities, that's not what they're interested in doing. The backdrop of the pandemic, aside from just making, fundraising more difficult, it's changing fundamentally how Canadians live their lives and how they think, and whether they want to be dealing with an election on top of that is something that's going to be very important for each of those parties to consider going forward.
Well, we know that they are getting the election year ready to go in case they have to. There's calls being made about who might be able to manage campaigns. There's calls being made about the possibility of booking planes and buses in case this all happens. A lot of this is going to center around the throne speech and what's in that and whether or not the opposition can support it. What did you make, Kirsty, this week of the reports that the Liberals could be looking at spending as much as $100 billion more, abandoning fiscal anchors, that senior officials inside the finance department are concerned about how much money this government might be looking at spending?
Yeah, I think this is definitely going to be an incredibly significant time for the government. We know, of course, that pandemic spending has been extraordinary, and the government is also looking at steering the way forward, moving into the recovery phase. And what does that look like? Based on what the Prime Minister has said and cabinet ministers have said, they are looking again at kind of a green recovery path. We don't have full specifics on what that will include, but I think that there is the indication, at least as far as, again, the NDP and the Green Party are concerned, it seems as though there could be quite a tilt left in this throne speech, perhaps enabling those parties to support the government. And then, with the non-confidence vote, there wouldn't be an election. So I think that what we're hearing from the government is a very strong signal that this is going to be a bold plan that they're going to put forward. That is the rationale they put forward for proroguing Parliament altogether, that there desperately needed to be this reset because of the unprecedented situation we're in. But, Globe sources have been suggesting, again, that because of the unprecedented level of spending, that this is making bureaucrats really nervous, and they want to see exactly what the government has in mind, because, again, this is really talking about a big amount of money going out the door.
Abigail, what are you hearing in terms of how they have to figure this out? Because on the one hand, we are living in unprecedented times. On the other hand, we are looking at unprecedented debt.
Well, if you're hearing these suggestions from the Prime Minister about this, these big plans and a big way to move forward, then they're feeling like Canadians are liking their plan and liking the big programs that have rolled out already in terms of, the high uptake of the CERB and how much Canadians needed that financial assistance. So it'll be interesting to see exactly where they go with that throne speech. But also remember, we never had a budget this year, right? We had that fiscal snapshot that we were all trying to figure out what exactly that meant. So it'll be interesting to see how detailed this throne speech really is about their plans, both in terms of the fact that we, need a clear picture of where things are and going forward, but also whether there is appetite for an election after the Liberals put those cards on the table.
Well, one of the things I've been hearing is that the opposition parties may not vote the government down on the throne speech, but the budget could be another issue. You could also slip a poison pill in there if you're the government to force the opposition's hand, say, well, we didn't cause the election. They did. In all of this, Aaron O'Toole, new Conservative leader, Christy, what are your thoughts on his performance so far? The latest polling seems to show that he's picking up steam, albeit not a lot yet. How have his first couple of weeks been?
I think from a communications perspective that it seems as though Aaron O'Toole, he seems pretty comfortable. He ran in the last leadership race for the Conservatives. Of course, he was not successful and Andrew Scheer became the leader, but you can see this time around he does have that experience, and he has been around Parliament Hill for a long time. He's been a cabinet minister, and so he does bring those skills to the table. This isn't, a new politician. This is someone who does bring that experience. I think in the last week, of course, there was the unfortunate incident with the tweet from Carrie Lynn Finlay and questions about why Aaron O'Toole did not immediately say anything about that. We did hear he held a news conference this week, and he suggested that he did reach out to Jewish leaders to indicate that the Conservatives are a strong supporter. But at the end of the day, I think that this was an unfortunate moment for the Conservatives, especially for a new Conservative leader. And I want to see how he's going to kind of wrangle the caucus. You had Andrew Scheer out this week in Regina doing a Sir John A. Macdonald event where a lot of people were suggesting that perhaps he was, igniting some of the controversy around Sir John A. Macdonald monuments. So I'm really curious to see the dynamics moving forward with the caucus, and as well how he can kind of really, put a mark on the party, show where he's going to take the direction of the party.
Okay, that's all the time we have today, but thank you very much, Abigail and Christy, for joining us today. And that's all the time we have for the show today as well, but we'll be right back here next Sunday on the West Block. Have a great long weekend.